Picture this for a second. It's the 1880s, right in the thick of a massive industrial revolution here in the United States. Now, if you were to walk up to an average person on the street and ask, hey, who's the most powerful man in America? Well, they almost certainly wouldn't say the president. No way. They'd likely point straight to corporate titans, guys like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, or Andrew Carnegie. We're talking about an era of absolute extremes, where literally 1/8 of the population owned 7/8 of the wealth. Executive power in the White House, it had completely fizzled out, totally overshadowed by the booming power of big business. So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tracing what has to be one of the most dramatic transformations in American history, the totally remarkable evolution of the presidency. We're going to see how this office went from a passive, highly restrained role into a globe-spanning powerhouse, all in the span of just about 30 years. It's a wild ride, so let's jump right in. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the passive presidency. Look at America's big leap onto the world stage. Talk about the absolute force of nature that was Theodore Roosevelt. Meet his reluctant successor, and wrap up with the emergence of the modern executive. All right, part one, the passive presidency, focusing on Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison. Take a look at this staggering number, 414. When Democrat Grover Cleveland took office back in 1885, he was definitely not what you'd call a proactive leader. He honestly believed the president's main job was simply to stop bad things from happening. Seriously, in his first term alone, he handed down an astonishing 414 vetoes. To put that in perspective, that's about twice as many as all of his predecessors combined. He didn't view the presidency as a platform for initiating change. He essentially saw himself as the government's chief watchdog. And Cleveland was, well, a fascinating guy for sure. While playing this rigid watchdog role, the 47-year-old bachelor actually secretly courted and married a 20-year-old college student named Frances Folsom. That makes him the first and only president to ever wed in the White House. Plus, you might know he's the only president in U.S. history to win 2 non-consecutive terms. But, his whole strict hands-off philosophy definitely had a darker side. When the devastating economic panic of 1893 hit during his second term, tens of thousands of people lost their jobs. And when an army of unemployed citizens marched on Washington to protest, Cleveland didn't offer a social safety net or a jobs program. He literally just had them arrested for trespassing. He flat out did not believe the national government was responsible for handing out help during a depression. Now, right between Cleveland's 2 terms was the deeply divided election of 1888, and this really highlights the clashing philosophies of the era. Cleveland had really alienated voters by opposing pensions for Civil War veterans and pushing for lower tariffs. On the flip side, you had Republican Benjamin Harrison, who was heavily backed by big business money. Harrison was all about high protective tariffs on foreign goods to shield American industry, and he promised to sweeping veteran pensions. Fun fact, just like in the modern year 2000, the guy who won the popular vote, Cleveland, actually lost the election because Harrison clinched the Electoral College. So Harrison gets in and tries to do right by his fellow veterans, presiding over America's very first billion-dollar Congress. But his massive pension legislation had some incredibly dark, exploitative consequences. When the law passed in 1890, it opened up this crazy loophole. Families literally started marrying off 14-year-old girls to 70-year-old veterans for one reason: to collect lifetime government pensions. Wild, right? Meanwhile, Harrison's massive import tax, known as the McKinley Tariff, caused massive consumer price spikes and fueled monopolies, which ultimately led to him losing his re-election bid right back to Cleveland. Moving on to part 2, America enters the world stage under William McKinley. When William McKinley took office in 1897, he brought this very modern, almost corporate management style to the White House. But his real test? That happened overseas. In February 1898, the USS Maine mysteriously exploded near Cuba, tragically killing 267 servicemen. Pushed by immense public outcry and some very loud pro-war voices in his own administration, McKinley reluctantly asked Congress to declare war on Spain that April. It ended up being an amazingly swift victory, and almost overnight, America emerged as a global imperial power, snapping up Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Now, what's really crucial here is why America took this massive leap, and how it actually mirrors our modern world. Our source material points out a direct parallel between McKinley's war with Spain and the 2003 Iraq War. In both cases, you have this incredibly complex mix of humanitarian idealism, like wanting to stop the brutal oppression of the Cuban people, mixed with some deep, deep self-interest. Americans really wanted economic relations with Cuba, and there was this overarching fear that if the U.S. didn't expand its military bases and lock down overseas resources, they'd just be overpowered by other empire-building nations. Before we leave McKinley, I have to share this fascinating bit of historical trivia. McKinley's calm, kind of masked demeanor and political style are actually widely believed to have inspired author L. Frank Baum to create the title character in his landmark novel, The Wizard of Oz. Kind of mind-blowing. Sadly, though, McKinley's story ends in tragedy. Just 6 months into his second term in 1901, he was assassinated by an unemployed anarchist who was furious at the severe disparity between the rich and the poor. Which brings us to part 3, the force of nature himself, Theodore Roosevelt. When 42-year-old Theodore Roosevelt suddenly became president, the guy was just an impossibly energetic force. Legend has it he drank a gallon of coffee a day. I mean, he just sucked the air out of every single room he walked into. And he immediately set his sights on what he saw as America's greatest evil, corporate monopolies. Remember that question we asked at the very beginning about who actually held the power? Well, Roosevelt decided to answer it. He directly sued J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Corporation to stop them from monopolizing the railways. This massive case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The monopoly was totally crushed, and Roosevelt proved that the American people, acting through the president, were the ones controlling the country, absolutely not the corporate trusts. Roosevelt was terrified that if corporate America didn't let off some steam, the whole country was just going to explode. So he rolled out these sweeping reforms that became known as the Square Deal. When the 1902 coal strike threatened to literally freeze the Northeast, Roosevelt totally broke precedent. He personally intervened and forced a settlement that actually favored the labor unions. Then, after author Upton Sinclair exposed the absolutely horrifying, unsanitary conditions of Chicago meat plants in his book The Jungle, Roosevelt didn't wait around. He rapidly pushed through the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. And on top of all that, noticing the rapid destruction of the American wilderness, he used the Antiquities Act to preserve over 230 million acres of land. Unbelievable. But listen, his actions abroad were just as aggressive as his domestic agenda. Roosevelt firmly believed America desperately needed a canal through Central America so they could rapidly move naval fleets around. When Colombia wouldn't accept his price for the land, Roosevelt just backed a local revolution, helped create the brand new nation of Panama, and got his canal anyway. He faced some incredibly heavy criticism for this high-handed, rule-bending approach, but he never apologized. In fact, he famously declared, "I didn't steal the Panama Canal, I built it." And that unapologetic aggression, that was the absolute hallmark of his defining foreign policy, big stick diplomacy. Roosevelt unilaterally invoked the Monroe Doctrine, basically declaring the United States as the official police power of the entire Western Hemisphere. The idea was, you didn't necessarily have to yell at other countries, but you had to be constantly, massively militarily prepared. You carry a big stick to intimidate them and enforce good behavior. He essentially turned the presidency into a position of intense global and moral leadership. That takes us to part 4, the reluctant president, William Howard Taft. So, Roosevelt decides not to run again in 1908, and he handpicks his best friend William Howard Taft as his successor. But guys, they were total opposites. Where TR was this athletic, boundary-pushing guy who vastly expanded executive power, Taft was an overweight, strict constitutionalist who really just loved to delegate responsibility. Actually, truth be told, Taft never even wanted to be president. He just wanted to be a judge. It was actually his highly ambitious wife who really pushed him into the White House. And Taft, he was absolutely miserable in that intense political spotlight. He got grumpy, he got depressed, and his weight ended up ballooning to 355 pounds. There's actually a really famous, incredibly humanizing, but honestly deeply humiliating story from his term. The president literally got stuck and had to be pried out of the White House bathtub. They eventually had to install a brand new one that was supposedly the size of a small swimming pool. But you know, that story perfectly physicalizes just how incredibly uncomfortable and ill-suited Taft felt wielding all this executive power. All right, part 5, a modern executive emerges and the lasting legacy of this era. So the crazy contrast between Taft and Roosevelt didn't just ruin a friendship, it permanently altered the landscape of American politics. Watching Taft slowly dismantle all his hard-won progressive policies just made Roosevelt boil over. By 1912, these two former best friends were openly destroying each other in the press. TR publicly called Taft a fathead and said he had the brains of about 3 guinea pig power. I mean, these insults literally left Taft in tears. When the Republicans ultimately decided to stick with Taft, TR stormed off and formed his own progressive bull moose party. This massive rift completely split the vote, which handed the election to Democrat Woodrow Wilson and left poor Taft with a humiliating 8 electoral votes. But hey, Taft's story actually ends on a surprisingly high note. He was absolutely thrilled to finally leave the presidency. After stepping down, he lost weight and eventually achieved his ultimate lifelong dream. He was appointed Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And paradoxically, despite all of Roosevelt's furious accusations, Taft actually ended up doing way more to successfully regulate monopolies through the courts than Roosevelt ever managed to do from the Oval Office. So let's just summarize this incredible momentum we've been covering. Back in the 1880s, we had presidents like Cleveland, who saw their job merely as vetoing bills, staying completely out of the way, and just yielding power to corporate monopolies. But fast forward to the 1910s, thanks to the imperial expansion under McKinley and the explosive, personality-driven governance of Roosevelt, the executive branch had totally transformed. It became the central, highly active engine of American governance, asserting this immense police power over the entire Western Hemisphere.
And we're going to leave you with this final provocative thought. After leaving office, William Howard Taft showed some pretty remarkable foresight. He warned the country about the dangers of an emerging 20th century imperial presidency and the very real potential for the abuse of executive power. So when we look around today at the immense, globe-spanning power held by the modern executive branch, what do you think? Was Taft right? Keep that in mind as you continue to explore the balance of power in our government today. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer